If you walk into a guitar store and pick up a Stratocaster with a maple fretboard, then put it down and pick up the same model with a rosewood fretboard, you are going to feel a difference under your fingers within the first 3 seconds. The boards do not feel the same. They do not look the same. And depending on who you ask, they do not sound the same either. But the reasons for that difference are not what most players think they are. The marketing language around fretboard wood has become so layered with mythology over the last 60 years that the actual physics underneath has been buried under decades of magazine reviews, forum debates, and YouTube tone tests with too many variables changing at once. Maple is bright. Rosewood is warm. Maple is fast. Rosewood is smooth. The cliches keep getting repeated, even when half of them are partially wrong. Today we are going through what actually changes when you switch between maple and rosewood fretboards. The physical differences, the feel differences, the real and measurable sonic differences, and the marketing claims that do not survive a controlled comparison. By the end, you will know which fretboard wood is right for you and why, and you will be able to ignore most of the language guitar salespeople use when they describe the boards on their walls. Let us start with the basic wood properties. Maple is a hardwood from the Acer genus, primarily harvested from eastern hard maple trees in North America. It is a closed-grain wood, which means the cellular structure is tight, the pores are small, and the surface is smooth and even. Maple has a high density, a light color that ranges from creamy white to pale yellow, and a tight, uniform grain pattern. When you cut a piece of hard maple, the surface comes out almost glassy. Rosewood is also a hardwood, but it comes from a completely different family of trees, the Dalbergia genus, which includes Indian rosewood, Brazilian rosewood, and several other regional varieties. Rosewood is an open grain wood, which means the cellular structure has visible pores and the surface has a natural texture. Rosewood is dense, but it contains natural oils that the maple does not. The color ranges from medium brown to dark chocolate, often with darker streaks running through it. These basic differences in wood structure drive everything else about how the two materials behave as fretboards. Because maple has a tight, closed-grain surface, it does not require the natural oils to maintain its smooth playing surface. But because maple is also lighter in color and porous enough to absorb sweat and oils from the player's fingers over time, it would discolor and stain quickly without protection. So maple fretboards are almost always sealed with a lacquer finish, the same nitrocellulose or polyurethane that is applied to the rest of the neck. This is why a maple board feels glossy or satin under your fingers. You are not actually feeling the maple, you are feeling the finish on top of the maple. Rosewood, in contrast, contains enough natural oils that it does not need to be finished to feel good or to resist staining. A rosewood fretboard ships from the factory unfinished with the natural texture and oil content of the wood itself directly contacting the strings and the player's fingers. Over time, the player's hand oils combine with the wood's own oils to create a smooth, broken-in feel that gets better with years of playing. This is the first major difference that affects how the boards feel. A maple board feels like a finished surface. A rosewood board feels like raw wood that has been sanded and polished. Both can feel great, but they feel completely different. Now let us talk about the sonic differences, because this is where the marketing language really starts to matter. The conventional wisdom is that maple boards sound bright, snappy, and articulate, while rosewood boards sound warm, mellow, and rounded. This is partially true and partially marketing language that has been amplified by repetition. The actual physics works like this. The fretboard is the surface that the strings are pressed against during fretting, and the material's density and stiffness affect how energy is transmitted from the string to the neck and back. A denser, stiffer wood reflects more high-frequency energy back into the string, which produces a slightly faster attack and a slightly brighter tonal character. A softer or more porous wood absorbs slightly more high-frequency energy, which can produce a marginally rounder attack profile. Maple is somewhat denser and stiffer than most rosewood species. The difference is real and measurable in lab conditions, but the magnitude of that difference is smaller than the marketing suggests. In controlled listening tests, where everything else about the guitar is held constant, players can sometimes hear a slight difference between maple and rosewood, but the difference is dwarfed by pickup choice, string gauge, scale length, bodywood, and amplifier settings. The honest truth is that fretboard wood matters, but it matters less than almost everything else in the signal chain. If you replace the maple fretboard on your Stratocaster with a rosewood fretboard tomorrow, you would notice the change. But if you also changed pickups, swapped strings, and adjusted your amp, the fretboard difference would be the smallest variable in the new sound. Now let us talk about the feel differences, because this is where the real practical impact lives. A finished maple board feels fast and slick. The lacquer surface allows fingers to slide easily, and the response under bending is direct and immediate. Players who like maple boards often describe them as having a snappy or articulate feel, where the fingers stay on top of the board rather than gripping into it. A rosewood board feels grippy under the fingers. The natural texture of the wood gives a small amount of friction that some players prefer for control, especially during bends and slides. The slightly softer feel of a rosewood board can also feel more comfortable during long playing sessions, because the texture absorbs hand sweat differently than a finished maple surface. There is also a sticky neck issue that some maple board players experience. When the lacquer finish on a maple neck gets worn or contaminated, the surface can become tacky or grippy in a way that interferes with smooth, fast playing. Some players sand down the back of their maple necks to remove the gloss finish, leaving a satin or raw maple surface that does not have the sticky issue. Rosewood does not have this problem because there is no finish to wear or contaminate. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. We cover guitar gear every week so you can play better and spend smarter. Now let us talk about something that completely reshaped the fretboard market in the last decade. In 2017, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, known as CITES, expanded its protections on rosewood and added significant restrictions on the import and export of rosewood across international borders. The regulations were tightened again in 2019 and 2021. The result was that guitar manufacturers, which had been sourcing rosewood from India, Madagascar, and other regions for fretboards for nearly a century, suddenly faced major supply chain disruptions and increased compliance costs. The industry response was to shift fretboard production toward alternative woods. Pau ferro, sometimes called Bolivian rosewood, even though it is not actually a Dalbergia species, became the most common substitute. Ebony, which has always been used on premium guitars, increased in production. Roasted maple, where the wood is heat-treated to darken it and stabilize its moisture content, started appearing on Stratocasters and other Fender models that historically used rosewood. Pau ferro is denser and harder than most rosewood species with a slightly tighter grain and a lighter color. It feels closer to ebony than to rosewood under the fingers. Some players prefer it. Others miss the original rosewood feel. The transition was largely a regulatory necessity rather than a tonal preference, and it has reshaped what most modern players actually experience as their fretboard wood. Ebony is denser, stiffer, and tighter grained than rosewood, with a black color and a smoother surface. It is traditionally used on classical guitars, high-end acoustic guitars, and premium electric guitars. The feel under the fingers is noticeably different from rosewood. Ebony is firmer, harder, and more glassy, which some players find ideal for speed and articulation. Roasted maple has become an interesting modern option. The heat treatment darkens the maple, stabilizes the moisture content, and reduces the need for finish. A roasted maple board can be left unfinished while still resisting the staining that would affect a regular maple board. The feel is somewhere between traditional maple and rosewood, with a smoother grip than finished maple, but a similar density profile. Now let us talk about the genre associations and why they exist. Country and bluegrass players have historically preferred maple boards, and there is a real reason for that preference beyond cultural tradition. The bright attack profile and the slick feel under the fingers work well for chicken picking, fast pull-offs, and the percussive playing style that defines those genres. Telecasters, which are the dominant country guitar, traditionally ship with maple necks and maple fretboards, and the combination has become the sound of the genre. Blues and jazz players have historically leaned toward rosewood. The warmer tonal character and the grippier feel suit the bending, sustaining, and vocal playing styles that define those genres. A Stratocaster with a rosewood board, played through a clean tube amp, produces the smooth singing tone that defined a generation of blues players. But these associations are looser than they used to be. Modern country players use rosewood boards. Modern blues players use maple boards. The fretboard wood is one variable in a complex tonal palette, and players have largely figured out that they can dial in any sound on any board if the rest of the rig is set up correctly. So how do you actually choose the right fretboard for you? The first question is about playing feel, because this is the variable you will actually notice every day. If you sweat heavily during long playing sessions, a rosewood or pal ferro board will probably feel better than a finished maple board, because the natural wood absorbs moisture differently than a lacquer surface. If you prefer a fast, slick feel under your fingers, a finished maple or roasted maple board will probably suit you better than a textured rosewood board. The second question is about the cosmetic preference. Some players love the look of a creamy maple board against a colored body. Others love the dark warmth of rosewood or the deep black of ebony. The fretboard is one of the most visually prominent parts of a guitar, and aesthetic preference is a perfectly valid factor in the decision. The third question is about whether the alleged tonal difference matters for your music. If you play through high-gain amps with heavy effects processing, the fretboard wood is going to be invisible in your final tone. The amp, the pedals, and the speakers will dominate the sound to the point that the fretboard contribution is essentially zero. If you play clean through a tube amp into a microphone, the fretboard contribution is more audible, but it is still smaller than your pickup choice, your string gauge, and your playing technique. The honest reality is that the fretboard wood matters mostly for how the guitar feels in your hands. The tonal differences are real, but small. The feel differences are real and significant, and they will affect how much you enjoy playing the instrument every day. Choose based on the feel. Let the tone follow. If you have been agonizing over whether to buy a maple board or rosewood board version of the same guitar, stop overthinking it. Pick the one that feels better when you play it. The recordings will sound great either way. Drop a comment and tell me which fretboard wood you primarily play, and whether your preference matches what the marketing language promised. And if you have a take on fretboard wood that we did not cover, I want to hear that too.